In the stillness of Los Angeles in 1947, when the post-war boom promised a glittering future for America, a crime so grisly and perplexing emerged that it would define the phrase "unsolved murder" for decades to come. The brutal killing of Elizabeth Short, forever remembered as the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth was just 22, an aspiring actress who had drifted to Hollywood chasing stardom like countless others. But instead of fame, she met a fate so horrific that it etched her name into the dark annals of American true crime. Her body was discovered on the morning of January 15th in a vacant lot in the Leimert Park neighborhood, cut cleanly in half at the waist, her skin pallid from being drained of blood, and a grotesque smile carved into her face by the murderer's blade. To this day, the details of the crime send shivers down the spine of even seasoned detectives. There was no blood at the crime scene, suggesting she had been killed and mutilated elsewhere. Her body had been washed and arranged in a deliberately theatrical pose, arms bent at sharp angles above her head, legs splayed open, as if the killer wanted to leave a macabre performance for the world to find. The press descended on the story like vultures, dubbing Elizabeth the Black Dahlia, after a film noir of the time called The Blue Dahlia, and noting her preference for wearing dark clothing, and almost overnight, her murder became a national obsession, symbolizing both the allure and the darkness of Hollywood's golden era. NTHE investigation was immense, drawing in hundreds of detectives, interrogating more than 150 suspects, and generating tens of thousands of pages of reports. At least 60 people confessed to killing Elizabeth Short over the years, some eager for the attention, others mentally unstable, and still others coerced under intense questioning, but none of them matched the evidence. The case files contain letters supposedly from the killer, taunting the police, one of which arrived in an envelope with words cut from newspapers that read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings letter to follow." Inside were Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book, all wiped clean of fingerprints and soaked in gasoline to destroy evidence. The chilling nature of the correspondence hinted at a sadistic personality, someone playing a game of cat and mouse with law enforcement. Despite the gruesome clues, investigators could never assemble enough to pin down the killer, and the suspects ranged from Hollywood doctors to drifters to high-profile celebrities rumored to have connections to Elizabeth. Each lead unraveled as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the shadow of a predator who had orchestrated not just a murder, but a spectacle designed to haunt. What makes the Black Dahlia case endure is not just the horror of Elizabeth's death, but the way her life became consumed by the legend of the crime itself. She was a young woman from Massachusetts who dreamed of being on the silver screen, who worked as a waitress and dated servicemen, who struggled in the chaotic post-war city like so many others. Yet the world remembers her not for her aspirations or struggles, but for the photograph of her smiling face juxtaposed against the mutilated corpse on the front pages. Even today, decades later, amateur sleuths, authors, and conspiracy theorists pore over the same crime scene photos and police reports, constructing elaborate theories that implicate everyone from organized crime figures to corrupt police officers, and yet the truth remains elusive. Among the most popular suspects was Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy physician with a reputation for depravity, who lived in a mansion not far from where Elizabeth's body was found. Years later, his own son, a retired LAPD homicide detective, would publicly argue that his father was the killer, pointing to recordings of him saying, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia." They can't prove it now, but like so many leads in this labyrinth, it remains circumstantial, compelling enough to fuel books and documentaries, but never conclusive enough to close the file. And over 75 years have passed since Elizabeth Short's body was laid bare in that empty lot, yet the case still pulses with fascination because it embodies the ultimate paradox of true crime. A crime so grotesque it feels cinematic, a victim so tragic she becomes immortalized, and a killer who remains an unseen phantom, untouchable by justice. To this day, detectives admit that solving the case is almost impossible. The evidence is too contaminated, the witnesses long dead, and the memories faded into myth. But the Black Dahlia lingers in the collective imagination not as just another unsolved murder, but as a reminder that evil can thrive in plain sight, feeding off the silence of time. Somewhere in the pages of history lies the identity of the person who slaughtered Elizabeth Short, a name that may never be revealed, leaving us forever trapped in the uneasy knowledge that some killers slip through the cracks, their crimes never punished, their shadows never lifted. In the quiet northern wilderness of Alaska, where snow smothers sound and the night sky lingers for endless hours, a predator stalked women for over a decade, his crimes so carefully concealed, so methodically executed, that for years no one knew just how many had fallen. They called him the Butcher Baker, but his real name was Robert Hansen, and while he was eventually caught and convicted, what chills the spine to this day is the haunting truth that many of his victims' bodies were never recovered, and some cases linked to him remain open, drifting in the limbo of unsolved crimes, as though the frozen land itself swallowed them. In the 1970s and 1980s, Anchorage was booming from oil money, and with prosperity came a thriving nightlife. Bars, strip clubs, and sex work flourished in the city's seedy underbelly, attracting young women looking for quick cash or escape. It was here, in the shadows of this neon-lit economy, that Hansen hunted. By day he was a respected baker, a family man, a churchgoer. But when night fell, he transformed into something primal, prowling the streets for women he could abduct, fly into the wilderness in his private plane, and release into the icy woods like prey in a grotesque game of cat and mouse. Armed with a hunting rifle and a knife, he stalked them through the underbrush, relishing the fear, before finally striking them down and burying their remains in shallow, unmarked graves across the Alaskan tundra. What makes Hansen's legacy all the more disturbing is the way his crimes remained hidden for so long, concealed beneath layers of respectability and the harsh environment that devoured evidence. Women went missing, yes, but in a transient city, flush with newcomers, drifters, and those already living on society's margins. Disappearances were often dismissed as runaways or addicts vanishing by choice. The police struggled to connect the dots between missing dancers, waitresses, and sex workers, their names blending into the long list of Alaska's lost. Meanwhile, Hansen lived quietly among them, baking pastries at his shop, attending community events, and cultivating the image of a harmless, socially awkward man. He was even admired by fellow hunters for his skill with a bow and arrow, holding records for trophy kills. The irony is almost unbearable. The same steady hands that decorated cakes with sugar and flour also tied ropes, wielded knives, and fired bullets into terrified women. Yet for years he moved undetected, a wolf in the skin of a humble townsman, while families elsewhere in America received the dreaded calls that their daughters were missing in Anchorage. When Hansen was finally caught in 1983, it was only because one of his intended victims, a 17-year-old girl named Cindy Paulson, managed to escape his grasp. Hansen had kidnapped her, shackled her in his home, and assaulted her repeatedly before preparing to fly her into the wilderness. But through sheer willpower, she broke free, running barefoot and handcuffed down the street until she found help. Her testimony painted a chilling picture of Hansen's methods, and though the police initially hesitated to believe her, her background as a sex worker unfairly undermining her credibility, her detailed account of Hansen's home and behavior forced them to take action. A search warrant revealed troves of evidence: jewelry from missing women, firearms, and an aviation map marked with tiny X's, each one believed to mark the burial site of a victim. When investigators began digging, they found shallow graves confirming Cindy's story. But what Hansen admitted to during questioning was even more horrifying. He confessed to killing at least 17 women, though the number may be far higher. His memory selective or deliberately obscured. For everybody they uncovered, there were others that remained lost, buried too deep in the permafrost, or carried away by time and wildlife. The tragedy of Hansen's crimes is not just in the brutality of the acts, but in the way justice came too late for so many. Families waited decades for answers, some never receiving them, their daughters, fates forever classified as unsolved disappearances rather than confirmed murders. The Alaskan wilderness is vast and merciless. Even with modern forensics, many of Hansen's marked X's yielded no remains, and it is believed that some women were scattered so completely by scavengers or the elements that no trace of them will ever be found. Thus, while Hansen himself was captured and sentenced to life in prison, the cases of his missing victims linger unresolved. Their killers technically never caught, because their murders cannot be legally tied to him with certainty. The system demands proof, remains, evidence, identification, but nature provided him with the perfect cover. In a grim twist, Hansen became both murderer and ghostmaker, erasing women so thoroughly from existence that all that remains are whispers of names, faded photographs, and the terrible silence of unanswered questions. Today, the story of Robert Hansen haunts Alaska as both a warning and a scar. The wilderness that draws so many to its beauty also holds its secrets tightly, swallowing the cries of the lost. For every woman whose body was recovered, there are others whose fates are unknown, their graves unmarked, their killers unpunished. In the broader context of American crime, Hansen represents a terrifying archetype, the seemingly ordinary neighbor who masks a monstrous appetite, the family man whose smile hides the blood on his hands, the community member who is praised even as he prowls. But in Alaska, his crimes are remembered with particular bitterness because of how preventable some of them may have been. Early reports of missing women were dismissed, complaints ignored, and victims' voices silenced because of their profession. Society itself, in its prejudices and blind spots, gave Hansen the space to operate. And now, decades later, even with him long dead, the wounds remain open, the files marked, unsolved, the families still yearning for closure that may never come. In the end, Hansen's story is not just about one man's evil, but about the fragile line between justice and oblivion. It reminds us that killers can hide in plain sight, that society's indifference can be as deadly as a weapon, and that sometimes, even when the predator is caged, the ghosts of his victims wander forever unnamed. The Alaskan wilderness still holds its secrets, and the map Hansen left behind is less a confession than a cruel riddle, an admission that the dead are out there, somewhere beneath the ice, waiting to be found, while the killer who silenced them took the full truth to his grave. And Enel, in the quiet town of Texarkana, on the border of Texas and Arkansas, the spring of 1946 brought a wave of terror that would linger in the memories of its residents for generations. The case would come to be known as the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, a chilling series of attacks carried out by an unidentified assailant who was never caught, leaving the community in a perpetual state of fear. The crimes began in late February when a young couple, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae, were attacked while parked on a secluded road. Hollis was severely beaten, and LeRae was assaulted after being forced out of the car by a man wearing a white cloth mask with slits for the eyes and mouth. Both survived, but the ordeal was only the beginning of a nightmare that would spread across the town. And over the next 10 weeks, the so-called phantom killer struck multiple times, often targeting couples parked on dark, rural roads. His attacks escalated in brutality, with some victims being shot at close range and others beaten. The randomness of his victims and the eerily ritualistic timing of his assaults made him a specter that seemed to hover over Texarkana every weekend, especially on nights when the moon cast its cold glow across the countryside. The second attack came on March 24th, when Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found dead in Griffin's car on a lover's lane. Both had been shot in the head. Panic began to spread through the town, and residents quickly adjusted their routines. People stopped going out at night, windows were nailed shut, curfews were enacted, and some even armed themselves, fearing the phantom might strike at their homes. NTHE police, joined by the Texas Rangers, launched one of the largest manhunts in the region's history, but the killer proved as elusive as he was terrifying. On April 14th, the third attack left Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker dead, their bodies discovered several miles apart after being killed with a .32 caliber revolver. Booker, just 15 years old, was a talented saxophone player, and the shock of her brutal murder devastated the town. A final attack came in early May, when farmer Virgil Starks was shot twice through his window as he sat in his home. His wife, Katie, managed to survive, despite being wounded, while fleeing for help. This attack suggested that the phantom was growing bolder, targeting not just secluded couples but families within their own homes, which further heightened the terror. Dozens of suspects were interrogated, including petty criminals, drifters, and even local residents with known grudges, but no charges ever stuck. The most notorious suspect was U.L. Swinney, a habitual car thief who was arrested in 1946. While circumstantial evidence suggested possible links to the murders, nothing conclusive tied him to the crimes. With no physical evidence, the case collapsed, and Swinney was never formally charged with the murders. The uncertainty surrounding his involvement only deepened the mystery and allowed the legend of the Phantom Killer to grow. In the aftermath, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders became embedded in American folklore, inspiring books, documentaries, and even a cult horror film, The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Yet beneath the layers of myth and pop culture remains the harsh reality of unsolved tragedy. Families were left without justice, and the community lived for decades with unanswered questions about the identity of the masked killer who prowled their quiet town. Some residents speculated he was a local, hiding in plain sight, while others believed he was a transient who moved on once the heat grew too strong. To this day, the case remains one of the most haunting examples of a serial killer vanishing into history, his identity and motives forever obscured, his legend lingering in the silence of those moonlit Texas nights. In the long history of American crime, few names carry as much weight, dread, and fascination as the Zodiac Killer. Unlike many killers who strike silently, the Zodiac sought attention, taunted the press, and left behind a legacy of unsolved puzzles that still haunt investigators more than half a century later. His reign of terror began in the late 1960s in Northern California, and though the confirmed body count stands at 5, the Zodiac himself claimed to have killed dozens more. What makes this case particularly chilling is not only the brutality of the crimes, but the way the killer toyed with the public and authorities, leaving behind letters, codes, and cryptic threats that remain unsolved in their entirety to this day. On December 20th, 1968, in the small city of Vallejo, California, two teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, drove out to Lake Herman Road for a quiet night together. What awaited them was anything but peaceful. Their car was found parked on the side of the road, and both were shot without mercy. Betty Lou was killed instantly, while David died before reaching the hospital. There was no robbery, no sexual assault. Just cold, calculated execution. For months, the crime seemed like an isolated tragedy. But on July 4th, 1969, history would mark another bloody chapter. Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau were sitting in a parked car at Blue Rock Springs Park when a man approached and fired into the vehicle. Darlene was killed, while Mike survived with serious injuries. Minutes later, a phone call was made to the Vallejo Police Department. The caller confessed to the shootings and even claimed responsibility for the earlier Lake Herman Road murders. The man on the phone identified himself simply as the, quote, killer. It was the first time police realized they were dealing with a serial predator. In the weeks that followed, newspapers across California began receiving letters. These weren't ordinary confessions, but taunts, filled with strange symbols and cryptograms. The killer demanded that his ciphers be printed on the front page of newspapers, or he would kill again. In one of the letters, he signed off with a strange symbol, a circle with a cross through it, resembling a gun sight. Alongside this symbol, the killer gave himself a name, Zodiac. The Zodiac's first cipher, a 408-character puzzle, was cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife. The message revealed his obsession with killing, describing it as the most thrilling experience and hinting that murder would secure him slaves for the afterlife. The text was chilling, but it offered no real clues to his identity. The Zodiac had made good on his promise. He had terrified the public, and now the entire Bay Area was gripped with fear. On September 27, 1969, the Zodiac struck again in one of the most bizarre and theatrical attacks in criminal history. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking near Lake Berryessa when a man approached wearing a black hood, sunglasses, and the infamous crosshair symbol stitched onto his chest. He tied them both up before brutally stabbing them. Brian survived, but Cecilia later died from her injuries. After the attack, the Zodiac walked calmly to Brian's car and left a written message on the door, listing the dates of his previous murders and signing it with his crosshair symbol. The casual cruelty of this act sent shockwaves through California. Unlike most killers who hid in the shadows, the Zodiac seemed to thrive on being seen, heard, and feared. Just 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, a cab driver named Paul Steen was shot in San Francisco's Presidio Heights neighborhood. At first, police believed it was a robbery gone wrong, until a letter from the Zodiac revealed that it had been one of his murders. This letter included a piece of Steen's bloody shirt, leaving no doubt that the Zodiac was the killer. Witnesses described seeing a man calmly walking away from the scene, a white male in his late 30s, stocky, with glasses and brown hair. Despite police arriving within minutes, the killer slipped away, vanishing into the night. This was the last confirmed murder attributed to the Zodiac. But the letters kept coming, and the fear persisted. And between 1969 and 1974, the Zodiac sent more than 20 letters to newspapers, police, and even private citizens. These letters included cryptic ciphers, mocking threats, and strange references to movies, books, and pop culture. Some ciphers were solved, such as the first 408-character code, but others remain unbroken, including the infamous 340-character cipher sent to the San Francisco Chronicle. It wasn't until December 2020, over 50 years later, that a team of codebreakers finally cracked the 340 cipher. The decoded message revealed more ramblings about his hatred for society, but, again, it gave no clues to his real identity. It confirmed what investigators already knew. The Zodiac was a man obsessed with control, not just over his victims, but over the fear of an entire region. Over the decades, dozens of suspects have been investigated. One of the most infamous was Arthur Lee Allen, a man with a criminal record, a fascination with cryptography, and eerie connections to some of the crime scenes. He was even named publicly by investigators as a prime suspect. However, DNA tests and handwriting analysis later suggested that Allen might not have been the Zodiac after all. Other suspects included military veterans, ex-convicts, and even law enforcement officers, but none were definitively proven to be the killer. Each theory generated waves of speculation, books, and documentaries, but the true face of the Zodiac remained hidden. NBY the mid-1970s, the Zodiac's letters stopped. Whether he was dead, incarcerated, or simply moved on, no one knows. The murders ended as suddenly as they began, leaving behind a trail of fear, speculation, and unanswered questions. Amateur sleuths and professional investigators alike have dedicated their lives to unmasking the Zodiac. The rise of the internet has only fueled the obsession, with online communities poring over every cipher, every letter, and every clue. And yet, despite decades of effort, the mystery remains. NTHE Zodiac Killer's reign left a permanent scar on California. Beyond the 5 confirmed murders, he claimed in his letters to have killed as many as 37 people. While some investigators doubt that number, the mere possibility keeps the legend alive. What is certain is that the Zodiac changed the way Americans thought about crime. He showed that a killer could use fear itself as a weapon, that terror could be broadcast through newspapers, and that the mind of a murderer could leave as deep a wound as the act itself. NTHE Zodiac is not just remembered as a killer, but as a symbol of unsolved mystery. His cryptograms still haunt codebreakers. His letters still fascinate criminologists. His crimes still terrify anyone who dares to read about them in detail. The idea that he may have walked away and lived the rest of his life in complete anonymity is perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. In 1981, in the small city of Keddie, California, a brutal crime shook the quiet mountain community to its core. A crime so savage and perplexing that it remains unsolved to this day. It became known as the Keddie Cabin Murders, and despite decades of theories, investigations, and even suspects, no one has ever been convicted. Cabin 28, nestled in a modest resort area of Keddie, was home to 36-year-old Glenna Sue Sharp and her 5 children. Sue had moved there the previous year after separating from her husband, seeking a fresh start in the mountains with her family. On the evening of April 11, 1981, the children had friends over, as was typical. Sue's daughter Sheila went to spend the night at a neighboring cabin with her friend, a decision that would later save her life. The rest of the family stayed home, enjoying a simple night in. But by the morning of April 12th, what lay inside Cabin 28 would horrify investigators and haunt the town forever. When Sheila returned the next day, she walked into a nightmare. The living room bore the signs of a violent struggle, and 3 bodies were discovered. Her mother Sue, her 15-year-old brother John, and John's friend Dana Wingate, age 17. They had been brutally bound with tape, wire, and extension cords, and their injuries were shocking in their severity. The victims had been beaten, stabbed, and bludgeoned with a hammer, while Sue was additionally gagged and partially bound. The crime scene suggested a prolonged and frenzied attack, not a quick execution. Perhaps the most chilling detail was that Sue's younger children, Rick, Greg, and young Tina, were missing from the cabin, though later it was revealed that the two boys had been spared in a bedroom, apparently sleeping through the slaughter. Tina, however, was gone without a trace. NTHE investigation immediately raised more questions than answers. Despite the horrific violence, there was no clear sign of forced entry, suggesting the killers may have been known to the victims or were let in willingly. Multiple weapons appeared to have been used, pointing to the possibility of more than one perpetrator. Neighbors reported hearing muffled noises that night, but no one called the police, assuming it was ordinary household sounds. The authorities, overwhelmed by the brutality of the scene, struggled to preserve evidence properly. It was later criticized that crime scene management was sloppy, with potential clues being overlooked or contaminated. A year later, in 1984, a grim discovery was made. Tina's skeletal remains were found miles away from the cabin in a wooded area. The discovery deepened the mystery, suggesting she had been abducted during the attack and later killed. Why she was taken while the younger boys were left alive is still a haunting question. Some theorize Tina was the intended target all along, though no motive was ever firmly established. Over time, suspicion fell on two men connected to the Sharps, Martin Smart, a neighbor, and his friend John Bo Bubide. Smart was Sue's neighbor in Ketty, and reports suggested there had been tensions between him and Sue, particularly involving Sue's advice to his wife about leaving him due to alleged abuse. Smart reportedly even confessed to a therapist about involvement in the murders, but the confession never led to charges. His friend Bo, a man with a criminal past, was also questioned. Both men had suspicious behavior following the murders, but due to lack of solid evidence, neither was arrested. NTHE case remained cold for decades, though renewed efforts in the 2000s and 2010s brought new attention. Modern investigators uncovered evidence suggesting a cover-up or mishandling of the case early on, with potential leads being ignored. Rumors circulated that local law enforcement had ties to the suspects, further fueling conspiracy theories. Some audio recordings discovered years later hinted at confessions, yet the fragmented and incomplete nature of the evidence has left the case unsolved. NTHE Ketty Cabin murders remain one of the most disturbing and mysterious unsolved cases in American history. The brutality of the attack, the abduction and murder of Tina, the mishandling of evidence, and the fact that suspects were named yet never charged. All these details leave a chilling legacy of unanswered questions. For Sheila, who discovered the bodies, and the surviving Sharp children, the pain of that night has lingered for decades. Cabin 28 itself was eventually demolished in 2004, but its dark legacy lives on in books, documentaries, and countless true crime investigations. To this day, no one knows exactly who carried out the killings, why Tina was singled out, or why justice has eluded this case for so long. In 1947, Los Angeles was already a city of dreams and illusions, a place where countless young women arrived in search of stardom, beauty, or even just survival. But it was also a city with a darker undercurrent, a place of hidden violence and secrets that lurked in the shadows of its glittering streets. That darkness came into horrifying clarity when the mutilated body of a young woman was discovered in a vacant lot on January 15th of that year. She was soon identified as Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress whose name would forever be tied to one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history. The press gave her a nickname that stuck, the Black Dahlia, and from that moment, her story became a mixture of mystery, tragedy, and legend. Elizabeth was born in Boston in 1924, the third of 5 daughters in a family fractured by hardship. Her father abandoned the family during the Great Depression, leaving her mother to raise the children alone. Elizabeth grew up with a longing for something greater, something beyond the small towns and struggles of her youth. By her teenage years, she had cultivated a striking appearance, dark hair, pale skin, and a sense of glamour that drew attention wherever she went. Friends described her as quiet yet charismatic, a dreamer with a romantic view of the world. When she moved to California, she hoped for a career in film, like so many others who flocked to Los Angeles in the 1940s. But instead of finding stardom, Elizabeth's life took a path filled with instability, failed romances, and the constant struggle to survive in a city that thrived on exploiting the vulnerable. In the weeks leading up to her death, Elizabeth was drifting between hotels, apartments, and acquaintances, homes. She didn't have steady work, nor did she have the stability of family close by. She was known to be polite, sometimes reserved, but often seemed caught between moments of desperation and hope. Her beauty and charm made her a fixture in the nightlife of Los Angeles, but beneath the surface, she was adrift. And on the morning of January 15, 1947, a woman walking with her young daughter through an empty lot on South Norton Avenue made a discovery so gruesome that it would haunt the city for decades. Elizabeth's body lay severed in half at the waist, carefully posed, with her arms raised above her head and her mouth slashed into a chilling, permanent smile. Her skin had been scrubbed clean, and there was no blood at the scene, indicating she had been killed elsewhere and deliberately placed there. The brutality of the crime was unlike anything investigators had seen before. The precision of the cuts suggested some medical or surgical knowledge, while the staging of the body spoke of a sadistic mind that wanted their work to be found, displayed, and remembered. NTHE investigation immediately captured headlines. Newspapers sensationalized Elizabeth's life, embellishing her story with lurid details, often painting her as a femme fatale who lived dangerously. The press coined the name the Black Dahlia, a play on a popular film at the time, The Blue Dahlia. Combined with her penchant for wearing black clothing, the media frenzy was relentless, turning Elizabeth from a struggling young woman into a mythic symbol of mystery and corruption in Los Angeles. Police were overwhelmed with tips, false confessions, and dead ends. More than 150 suspects were interviewed, including doctors, soldiers, ex-boyfriends, and even complete strangers who claimed involvement. Theories ranged from the possibility of a jealous lover to the work of a deranged surgeon. One of the strongest early suspects was a man named Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner who knew Elizabeth and had once let her stay at his home. Another was Dr. George Hodel, a physician whose connections and eccentric behavior drew suspicion. Decades later, his own son, a retired LAPD detective, would argue publicly that his father had been the killer, citing circumstantial evidence and disturbing family history. But at the time, no one was ever charged. As the investigation dragged on, the brutality of the case and the failure to solve it drew criticism. The LAPD was accused of corruption, incompetence, and even deliberately covering up leads. The sheer spectacle of the case made it nearly impossible to separate fact from rumor. Letters supposedly from the killer were sent to newspapers, taunting police and mocking their inability to catch him. Some contained personal belongings of Elizabeth, strengthening the belief they were genuine. Yet even these leads eventually dissolved into uncertainty, leaving investigators chasing shadows. What makes the Black Dahlia case so haunting is not only the violence of Elizabeth's murder, but the way her story was consumed and distorted. She became more symbol than person, remembered not for her life, but for her death. Behind the sensationalism, however, was a real young woman whose life had been cut short in the most horrific way. Her dreams of becoming an actress, her struggles to find stability, her quiet charm and striking beauty, all of it was reduced to a nickname and a headline. Over the decades, countless theories have emerged. Some believe she was killed by a spurned lover, others that she was the victim of a sadistic predator with surgical knowledge. Still others believe her death was part of a larger pattern of killings, linked to other unsolved murders of women in Los Angeles during that period. None of these theories have ever been conclusively proven. Each new book, documentary, or article adds another layer of speculation, but no resolution. And today, the Black Dahlia case stands as one of the most enduring mysteries in true crime history. The empty lot where her body was found has long since been built over, but the memory of what happened there still lingers. For many, Elizabeth Short represents the dark side of Hollywood's golden age. The broken dreams, the exploitation, and the way vulnerable young women were consumed by a city that promised everything, but often delivered tragedy. For her family, the wound never fully healed. They watched as her memory was turned into a spectacle while justice slipped further and further away. NTHE crime remains officially unsolved, with the Los Angeles Police Department keeping the file open to this day. But with the passing of time, the chances of closure grow slim. The killer, whoever he was, has almost certainly gone to the grave without being held accountable. What remains is the story, the mystery, and the unsettling image of a young woman whose life was stolen in the most brutal way possible. Elizabeth Short's murder is remembered not just because of its horror, but because of what it revealed about the world around her, a world that fed on glamour while hiding its rot beneath the surface. In the end, her story is a reminder of how easily people can be lost, forgotten, or consumed by the myths others create. The Black Dahlia will always be a name tied to mystery, violence, and unanswered questions, a chilling symbol of a crime that time has never managed to bury. In the quiet farming community of Texarkana, straddling the border of Texas and Arkansas, life in the mid-1940s was simple and uneventful. But in 1946, the town was thrown into a nightmare when a mysterious figure, later dubbed the Phantom Killer, began stalking young couples in parked cars on deserted roads. His attacks were brutal, methodical, and left the town living in fear for months. The first victims, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae, were attacked on a lover's lane. Jimmy was beaten nearly to death, while Mary was sexually assaulted and terrorized. Both survived, but their descriptions of the masked assailant gave police their first and only real clue. The attacker wore a white sack-like mask with holes cut out for eyes and a mouth, resembling a twisted scarecrow come to life. Soon, the killer escalated. He ambushed another couple, Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, shooting them both in cold blood and leaving their bodies inside their car. Weeks later, Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, a beloved local saxophone player, were killed in a similar manner. Each crime carried the same eerie signature. The victims were couples, isolated, attacked swiftly, and with little evidence left behind. Panic spread like wildfire. Residents locked their doors, armed themselves, and refused to go out at night. Fear turned Texarkana into a ghost town after dark, and rumors swirled of the killer hiding among them. Perhaps a farmer, a soldier returning from the war, or even a local lawman. Law enforcement from both Texas and Arkansas, along with the Texas Rangers, joined the investigation, but the Phantom Killer always seemed one step ahead. Some suspected Ewell Swinney, a petty criminal with a history of car theft and violence, whose wife hinted at his involvement in the murders. Yet her testimony couldn't hold up in court due to spousal privilege, and without physical evidence, authorities had no choice but to let the suspicion linger without resolution. NTHE murders stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving Texarkana scarred and unsettled. For decades, theories about the Phantom Killer have haunted true crime circles. Was it Swinney, after all, or someone entirely different who blended back into ordinary life? Some even believe the killer left Texarkana and continued killing elsewhere under another name. What remains certain is that the Phantom Killer's reign of terror turned a small town into a place of legend, so much so that it inspired the cult horror film The Town That Dreaded Sundown. But unlike the movie, real life offered no closure, no captured villain, and no sense of justice. The Phantom simply disappeared, leaving behind broken lives, lingering fear, and a story that endures as one of the most chilling cases where the killer was never caught. In the late 1960s, San Francisco was a city alive with cultural revolution, music, and dreams of freedom. But hidden in the fog and glitter of that era lurked a figure whose name would forever be etched into the darkest pages of American true crime, the Zodiac Killer. More than 50 years later, his identity remains one of the most infamous mysteries, and despite countless investigations, documentaries, and amateur sleuths dedicating their lives to solving the puzzle, the man behind the coded letters and ruthless killings has never been caught. NTHE terror began on December 20th, 1968, when high school students David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were parked on a quiet stretch of road in Vallejo, California. What was supposed to be an innocent evening turned into a bloodbath when a man approached their car and opened fire. Betty Lou died instantly, while David succumbed to his injuries soon after. At first, the murders seemed like another tragic Lover's Lane killing, but months later, on July 4, 1969, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were ambushed in a similar fashion. This time, Mike survived, offering a description of the shooter, a heavy-set man in his late 20s to early 40s wearing glasses. Shortly after, the killer began sending cryptic letters to local newspapers. He taunted police, described his crimes in chilling detail, and most famously included cryptograms, puzzles that he claimed contained his identity. One of the most unsettling parts of his letters was his insistence that he would kill not only for pleasure, but to collect slaves for the afterlife. Signed with a symbol resembling a crosshair, the letters announced the arrival of a sadistic genius who thrived on fear. NHI's crimes grew bolder. In September 1969, he attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard while they picnicked at Lake Berryessa. Wearing a black hood emblazoned with his crosshair symbol, he bound the couple and stabbed them repeatedly. Cecilia died from her wounds, while Brian miraculously survived to tell the tale. The image of a masked man calmly describing himself as the Zodiac while carrying out a brutal crime added to the aura of calculated madness. Just 2 weeks later, in San Francisco, cab driver Paul Steen was shot point-blank in his vehicle. This time, the killer was seen by multiple witnesses. Children who spotted him wiping down the car before walking away into the night. Despite being so close to capture, police lost him in the maze-like streets. As his notoriety grew, so did his correspondence. The Zodiac claimed responsibility for up to 37 murders, though investigators could only definitively link him to a handful. His letters contained riddles, coded messages, and references to pop culture, including films and literature. Some ciphers have been solved, revealing disturbing messages, such as his desire to continue killing and his belief in an afterlife where his victims would serve him. Others, like the famous 340-character cipher, remained unsolved for over 50 years before a team of amateur cryptographers finally cracked it in 2020. Even then, the message only deepened the mystery, as it revealed no name, only further taunts about how the police would never catch him. Suspects emerged over the years. Arthur Lee Allen, a schoolteacher with a disturbing history, became the prime suspect, especially after acquaintances described his violent tendencies and obsession with young women. His watch even bore the Zodiac's infamous crosshair symbol, yet DNA evidence and handwriting comparisons failed to conclusively tie him to the crimes. Others, like Richard Gaikowski, a journalist, and Earl Van Best Jr., identified decades later by his son, were also considered. Theories multiplied, but certainty remained elusive. NTHE's Zodiac case had a chilling effect on the Bay Area. parents warned their children about staying out late. Couples avoided isolated roads. Police were overwhelmed with false leads, prank letters, and terrified citizens convinced the killer lived next door. Yet, in time, the letters slowed, the killings stopped, and the Zodiac faded into myth. Whether he died, was imprisoned for unrelated crimes, or simply chose to stop, no one knows. What sets the Zodiac apart from other killers is not just the brutality of his crimes, but his ability to manipulate the media and the public psyche. He turned murder into a performance, feeding on fear and confusion, and leaving behind an enduring enigma. Even now, decades later, new theories surface, amateur detectives pore over his ciphers, and internet forums buzz with speculation. He has become part of America's cultural fabric, a grim reminder of evil's ability to thrive in plain sight. Zodiac's identity remains locked in shadows. His mocking words, "I am waiting for a good movie about me," echo eerily across time. In the end, the killer achieved what he desired most: immortality through terror. The Zodiac Killer remains uncaught, unmasked, and perhaps the most infamous unsolved murderer in American history. In the early 20th century, the city of New Orleans carried an energy unlike any other place in America. It was a city built on layers of cultures: French, Spanish, Italian, Creole, African, Caribbean. And with that came a nightlife and music scene that had already made it legendary. But beneath the sound of jazz echoing through its streets, beneath the smells of spices rising from corner groceries and butcher shops, something dark was festering. Between 1918 and 1919, an unknown killer haunted New Orleans, breaking into homes late at night and wielding an axe with horrifying precision. His victims were not wealthy elites nor political figures, but mostly working-class families, often Italian grocers and their wives, who lived quiet, modest lives. This phantom came to be known as the Axeman of New Orleans, and though his reign of terror lasted less than 2 years, his legend has lived for more than a century, largely because he was never caught. NTHE's story begins on May 23, 1918, in a quiet neighborhood when grocer Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were found brutally attacked in their own bedroom. Someone had entered the home, cut their throats with a straight razor, and then bashed their heads with an axe. Blood was splattered across the walls, and yet strangely the killer had left the weapon behind. The straight razor used in the attack belonged to Joseph's brother, who lived nearby, but nothing else connected him to the crime. Police were baffled. It wasn't just the violence that was shocking. It was the senselessness. Nothing was stolen. The couple had no known enemies. Their deaths felt random, yet deliberate. Weeks later, on June 27, 1918, another Italian grocer named Louis Bessumer and his mistress Harriet Lowe were attacked in the back of their shop. They too were struck with an axe while they slept, and both survived the initial attack, though Harriet later died of her injuries. She whispered accusations against Bessumer himself, saying he was the one who had tried to kill her. but there was no evidence to support her claim. Detectives pursued different leads, including rumors that the crimes were connected to mafia extortion, but each theory collapsed under scrutiny. In August of that year, it was clear this was no ordinary series of robberies or domestic disputes. On August 5th, Mrs. Edward Schneider, 8 months pregnant, was attacked while sleeping in her home. She awoke to see a tall figure standing above her before she was struck repeatedly in the head. Somehow, both she and her unborn child survived. Then, on August 10th, the killer struck again, this time targeting Joseph Romano, another grocer who died from his injuries. Witnesses described a dark figure fleeing the scene, but the details were vague. Panic spread through the Italian-American community of New Orleans. People began sleeping with weapons under their beds. Shopkeepers stood guard outside their stores at night. The city's police force, overwhelmed and confused, had no clear strategy. Newspapers sensationalized the killings, and soon the axeman's crimes became front-page headlines. And then, as suddenly as they had started, the attacks stopped. For several months, New Orleans held its breath, waiting for another strike. None came, until March of 1919, NTHAT month. A letter arrived at the offices of the Times-Picayune, written in a chilling, taunting tone. It was signed by the Axeman himself. The letter claimed he was not a mortal man, but a demon from hell who thrived on blood. He mocked the police for failing to catch him, and then issued an eerie proclamation. On the night of March 19, 1919, he would descend upon the city again, and anyone whose home was not filled with the sound of jazz would meet their end. Terrified, residents of New Orleans obeyed. On that night, jazz filled every corner of the city. Bands played in clubs, restaurants, and even on street corners. Families with phonographs played records into the early hours of the morning. The city did not sleep, and by sunrise, not a single person had been attacked. The Axeman had kept his word, and the strange incident cemented his legend forever in the city's folklore. NBUT. His reign wasn't over. Just months later, in August 1919, the Axeman struck again, killing Steve Boca, another grocer, in his home. In October, he attacked Mike Pepitone, leaving him dead in a room spattered with blood. The sheer brutality of Pepitone's murder shocked even the most hardened investigators. And then, as abruptly as it had all begun, the killing stopped. Theories about the Axeman's identity swirled for decades. Some believed he was a deranged individual who targeted Italian grocers due to racial prejudice or financial resentment. Others speculated that the murders were linked to organized crime, and that the axe attacks were punishments for those who refused to pay protection money. Another theory suggested that the Axeman was simply a sadist, someone who killed for the thrill and took pleasure in taunting both the police and the public. The letter he sent to the newspaper only deepened the mystery. Was it truly written by the killer, or a hoax by someone trying to stir panic? The language of the letter, grandiose, theatrical, almost supernatural, painted the author as someone who saw himself not as a man, but as a force of evil. He claimed he could not be caught because he was not human. Of course, Detectives dismissed this as nonsense, but it left an indelible mark on the case. No suspect was ever definitively proven to be the Axeman. Some names surfaced, including a man named Joseph Mumfre, who was allegedly shot and killed by the widow of one of the victims in 1921. According to one account, she believed Mumfre was responsible for her husband's murder and possibly the Axeman killings. But historians have since found inconsistencies in the story. Other possible suspects included transient laborers or mentally ill individuals who passed through the city, but again, no evidence ever tied anyone directly to the crimes. The impact of the Axeman on New Orleans was profound. He turned ordinary families into symbols of fear. He transformed the sound of jazz into something more than entertainment. It became a literal shield against death for one unforgettable night. To this day, the story of the Axeman is retold not just as a crime, but as a piece of folklore, blending fact and legend into something enduring. What makes the Axeman particularly terrifying, even compared to other unsolved killers, is the randomness of his attacks. His victims weren't wealthy, weren't powerful, and had nothing in common other than their vulnerability. He entered their homes while they slept, and he used tools, an axe or a razor, that belonged to the very households he invaded. It gave the impression that no one was safe, that even the most ordinary family could be marked for slaughter without reason. For investigators, the Axeman's crimes represented a failure. Despite eyewitnesses, despite patterns, despite the brutality of his actions, he slipped away into history without ever being unmasked. For the people of New Orleans, he became a ghost story, a reminder that evil can walk among us and vanish without consequence. And for historians, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts, the Axeman remains a case study in the nature of terror. How a single unknown figure can grip an entire city and force it to dance to his tune, literally and figuratively. And over 100 years later, the Axeman's identity is still unknown. His victims, their families, and their stories have faded into history, but the legend has not. When people talk about the darkest chapters in the history of American crime, the Axeman of New Orleans still stands out, not just for the blood he spilled, but for the strange and haunting way he held a city hostage, with nothing more than fear, violence, and a demand for music. In the quiet town of Texarkana, straddling the border between Texas and Arkansas, a series of murders in 1946 created an enduring mystery that continues to haunt criminal history. The killer, who came to be known as the Phantom Killer or Phantom Slayer, launched a reign of terror that left residents paralyzed with fear. Between February and May of that year, the Phantom brutally attacked 8 people in 4 separate incidents, leaving 5 of them dead. What set this case apart was not just the brutality of the crimes, but the randomness and the fact that, despite numerous suspects and decades of investigation, the killer was never caught. The lack of resolution turned the Phantom into a chilling legend, one that has both fascinated and terrified generations. NTHE first attack took place late on the night of February 22, 1946. A young couple, Jimmy Hollis and his girlfriend, Mary Jean LeRae, were parked on a secluded road when a man wearing a white cloth sack over his head, with cutouts for eyes and mouth, approached their car. He shined a flashlight at them and ordered them out. Hollis was beaten severely with a pistol, fracturing his skull, while Mary was assaulted and terrorized before managing to escape. Both survived, but the bizarre appearance of the masked attacker, combined with his extreme violence, would set the tone for the weeks to come. NTHE's second attack happened less than a month later, on March 24th. Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found dead in their car on a lonely road. Griffin had been shot in the back of the head, while Moore was also shot and possibly sexually assaulted. Panic began spreading quickly across Texarkana. The pattern suggested the killer targeted couples in secluded areas, and young people were especially warned against going out at night. Police patrols increased, and locals began arming themselves. Still, the phantom struck again. On April 14th, Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker became his next victims. Martin was found dead on the side of the road with multiple gunshot wounds, while Betty Jo's body was found 2 miles away. She too had been shot, and the brutality of the murders stunned investigators. Both were teenagers, and Betty Jo was well known in the community as a talented saxophone player. The murders triggered widespread panic. Rumors spread quickly, and many residents began locking their doors for the first time in years. Businesses closed earlier. Movie theaters saw fewer customers, and people carried shotguns when stepping outside. The final confirmed attack came on May 3rd, when Virgil Starks, a farmer, was shot twice through his window while sitting in his living room. His wife Katie was also shot but managed to escape and survive. Unlike the earlier crimes, this attack occurred inside a home, which escalated the fear even further. The sense of safety the townspeople had clung to, that the phantom only targeted couples in secluded places, was shattered. Now it seemed no one was safe, not even in their own homes. Law enforcement poured immense resources into the investigation. The Texas Rangers, FBI agents, and local police all worked together, interviewing hundreds of suspects and chasing down countless leads. Several men were arrested and interrogated, but none were definitively connected to the murders. One man, U.L. Swinney, a car thief, was considered a prime suspect. His wife reportedly gave a confession implicating him, but because spousal testimony was not admissible in court at the time, and with no physical evidence to tie him directly to the killings, he was never formally charged. Some investigators remained convinced Swinney was the phantom, but the lack of proof meant the case stayed open. NTHE murders stopped after May 1946, leaving both investigators and the public with unanswered questions. Why had the phantom stopped? Had he been jailed for another crime? Had he died or moved away? Or was he still living among them, hiding in plain sight? The uncertainty only deepened the mystery. NTHE Texarkana Phantom Case has since become one of the most notorious unsolved crime sprees in American history. It inspired folklore, books, and even the 1976 horror film The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which fictionalized the events but ensured the killer's legend lived on. Even today, theories abound, with amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts continuing to debate the identity of the Phantom. NFOR the people of Texarkana, though. The legacy of the Phantom Killer is far more than just a mystery. For months in 1946, an entire community lived under the shadow of fear, altering their routines and lives, uncertain if the man with the sack over his head might strike again. And while the murders eventually stopped, the fear never truly left. The Phantom Killer, whoever he was, remains a chilling reminder of how some crimes, no matter how much time passes, can never be fully resolved. In the heart of Chicago during the 1980s, a wave of fear spread across the city after a series of mysterious poisonings claimed multiple lives. These tragedies became known as the Chicago Tylenol murders, one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. The story begins on September 29, 1982, when 7 people died suddenly after taking extra-strength Tylenol capsules that had been laced with potassium cyanide. The deaths were terrifyingly random, striking ordinary families and creating a climate of hysteria that would forever change the way medications were packaged. NTHE first victim was Mary Kellerman, a 12-year-old girl from Elk Grove Village who woke up feeling unwell. Her parents gave her a Tylenol capsule, believing it would ease her symptoms. Within hours, Mary collapsed and died. Her sudden death shocked doctors, but the cause was not immediately clear. Later that same day, 27-year-old Adam Janus of Arlington Heights also collapsed and died after taking Tylenol for chest pains. His family, grieving his sudden passing, gathered at his home. In a cruel twist of fate, Adam's brother Stanley and his sister-in-law Teresa also took Tylenol from the same bottle, both collapsing within minutes. Stanley died, and Teresa was left in critical condition. As the day went on, more mysterious deaths occurred. Mary Reiner, a new mother recovering from childbirth, took Tylenol and died shortly after. Another victim, Paula Prince, a flight attendant, was found dead in her apartment with a Tylenol bottle nearby. In total, 7 lives were lost in just a few days, all linked to poisoned Tylenol capsules purchased from different stores in the Chicago area. Investigators soon discovered the capsules had been laced with lethal doses of cyanide. The poison acted quickly, shutting down the body's ability to use oxygen, leading to almost immediate collapse and death. Whoever had done this had tampered with bottles of Tylenol, placing them back on store shelves for unsuspecting customers to buy. The randomness of the crime, striking children, parents, young professionals, made it especially terrifying. Anyone who had Tylenol in their home now feared it could be deadly. NTHE response was immediate and massive. Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer of Tylenol, issued a nationwide recall of 31 million bottles, costing the company over $100 million. Store shelves were stripped of the product, and health officials warned the public not to take any Tylenol until the situation was under control. Police cars patrolled neighborhoods with loudspeakers, warning residents about the danger. Hospitals set up emergency hotlines to handle the flood of panicked calls. Despite the chaos, Johnson & Johnson's swift response was praised. The company worked with the FDA to introduce tamper-proof packaging, seals, foil wrappers, and child-proof caps, innovations that became standard across the pharmaceutical industry. The tragedy ultimately reshaped consumer safety worldwide. But while the safety of future products was secured, the identity of the person behind the murders remained a haunting mystery. Investigators pursued hundreds of leads. At one point, a man named James W. Lewis sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to, quote, "stop the killings." He was arrested and convicted of extortion, but authorities could not connect him to the actual poisonings. Others were investigated, but no one was ever charged for the murders themselves. NTHE randomness of the attacks meant the killer could have been almost anyone. Was it a disgruntled employee, a stranger with no connection to the victims, or someone seeking revenge? Decades of investigation have yielded no definitive answers. For the families of the victims, the lack of closure only deepened their grief. NTHE cultural impact of the Chicago Tylenol murders cannot be overstated. Beyond changing packaging laws, the case also altered the way Americans thought about everyday safety. For the first time, many realized how vulnerable the public could be to tampering in something as simple as medicine. The murders also introduced a new kind of fear, not of being targeted directly, but of becoming a random victim in an indiscriminate act of terror. And even today, more than 40 years later, the case remains unsolved. The FBI periodically revisits it, but the trail has long since gone cold. The killer, or killers, vanished without leaving behind enough evidence to be caught. NTHE Chicago Tylenol murders are remembered not only as a case of lives stolen too soon, but also as an example of how one horrifying act can change an entire nation. In the end, the most chilling part of this story is not just the 7 who died, but the fact that the person responsible has never been identified, leaving open the terrifying possibility that they walked away, unpunished, into the crowd. In the quiet stillness of East Meadow, Long Island, the night of October 30th, 1975, would be shattered by one of the most haunting unsolved murders in American history. It was a crime that left no clear suspect, no satisfying answer, only a legacy of grief and mystery that has endured for nearly 5 decades. This is the story of the unsolved murder of Martha Moxley. Martha was just 15 years old, bright, athletic, and full of life. She lived in the affluent community of Greenwich, Connecticut, in a neighborhood where sprawling homes and manicured lawns gave a sense of safety. On the night before Halloween, often called Mischief Night, Martha and a group of her friends wandered through the neighborhood as many teenagers did, playing harmless pranks, laughing, and enjoying the October air. For Martha, it was supposed to be just another night of teenage fun. NBUT, she never came home. NTHE, next morning, her body was found beneath a large pine tree in her own yard. She had been brutally beaten and stabbed with a golf club. The violence of the attack stunned investigators. It was personal, savage, and without mercy. The golf club used in the murder came from a set belonging to the Skakel family, Martha's neighbors, who were part of the Kennedy family's extended circle. That single detail would entangle the case in decades of controversy, legal battles, and unanswered questions. In the immediate aftermath, suspicion fell on the Skakel brothers, Thomas, 17, and Michael, 15, both of whom had spent time with Martha the night she died. Witnesses placed her with Thomas shortly before she disappeared. Yet the evidence was circumstantial, and the powerful influence of the Skakel family complicated the investigation. With resources, connections, and lawyers at their disposal, the Skakels were able to keep scrutiny at bay, at least temporarily, and for years, the case languished. Rumors swirled in the community, but no charges were filed. The Moxley family endured the agony of knowing their daughter's killer was still free, possibly living just houses away. It wasn't until the late 1990s, more than 20 years later, that the case was revived. Renewed interest came after books and television specials highlighted the tragedy, stirring public outrage and pressuring authorities to act. In 2000, Michael Skakel, then in his late 30s, was arrested and charged with Martha's murder. Prosecutors argued that he had been jealous of his brother's relationship with Martha and, in a fit of rage, had killed her. In 2002, Michael was convicted and sentenced to 20 years to life. For Martha's family, it seemed justice had finally been served. But the story did not end there. And, over the following years, the conviction unraveled. Skakel's legal team appealed repeatedly, claiming he had not received a fair trial. In 2013, a judge granted him a new trial, ruling that his defense had been inadequate. In 2018, the Connecticut Supreme Court upheld that decision, and Michael Skakel was released after more than a decade behind bars. Prosecutors ultimately declined to retry him, citing the passage of time and the difficulty of securing a conviction after so many years. And so, once again, Martha Moxley's murder returned to the realm of uncertainty. Was Michael guilty? Was it Thomas? Was it someone else entirely, perhaps outside the Skakel family, who had escaped suspicion because of the powerful shadow they cast? The evidence, a broken golf club, conflicting witness statements, shifting alibis, remains as murky as it was the morning after her death. NFOR, the Moxley family. The lack of resolution is its own kind of torment. They lost a daughter in the most brutal way, and decades of trials, reversals, and appeals have done little to ease that pain. For the Greenwich community, the murder was a chilling reminder that violence can strike even in the wealthiest, most secure neighborhoods, tearing through the illusion of safety. Today, Martha Moxley's murder remains officially unsolved. Some believe Michael Skakel was guilty all along, protected for years by wealth and influence. Others are convinced he was a scapegoat, unfairly targeted after decades of frustration. The truth may never be known. What is certain, however, is that a 15-year-old girl lost her life on a night that should have been filled with laughter and mischief. And nearly 50 years later, her story continues to haunt, a reminder of justice delayed and, perhaps, justice denied.